In this video I'm going to talk about depth of field. After watching this video, you know everything about depth of field. That's a promise. Hi there, I'm Peter Forsgaard, an Olympus visionary and a professional photographer from Helsinki, Finland. And before we start talking about the depth of field, please consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell so you get notified when there is a new video online. I post 2 videos a week, usually on Tuesdays and on Fridays. And remember, my channel is all about you getting to be better at photography and of course about Olympus gear. But let's start talk about the depth of field. There will be lots and lots of info about depth of field, and there will be timestamped links in the description of this video. So if there is something that you specifically want to know, just click the timestamp and you will be in that part of the video. But of course, watching the whole video is always nice. But let's start with the definition of depth of field, and I quote Wikipedia. Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and farthest objects that are in acceptably sharp focus in an image. That's how it is in Wikipedia about depth of field, and the keyword is acceptably sharp. So everything doesn't have to be really sharp, because actually the only thing that is sharp is the point where you have been setting the focus point. Everything else is less sharp, so we're talking about acceptably sharp. And by the way, it's quite windy out there, so if there is some wind noise, that comes from the windows of the balcony where I'm at right now. And there are 3 things that affect depth of field. Those 3 things are aperture, focal length, and the focusing distance. I did not mention sensor size, and the reason is that it does not affect the depth of field. I will talk about the sensor size in the later part of this video, where I compare the depth of field of micro four thirds and full frame. But let's talk about the first one. The first one is aperture. Usually aperture is controlled from the body. There are also lenses that have so-called aperture ring, where you set your aperture that you want. But nowadays in digital world, the most common way is to use the dials in your body. The smaller the aperture is, the bigger the depth of field is. And a smaller aperture means a large f number. And if you have a small aperture number, then the aperture is big and the depth of field is narrower or smaller. So that means that f16 gives you more depth of field than f2.8, for example. And here are 2 examples of that. The first picture is taken with the aperture 2.0 and the second one is f16. And I used the EM5 Mark III with the 12mm f2.8 lens. And you can clearly see that the depth of field is much bigger with the f16 than it is with f2.0. And also remember that if you stop down too much, diffraction will start to ruin your sharpness of your image. Usually in general photography, it doesn't really matter. You really don't see unless you're a pixel peeper. But in macro photography, this thing is very crucial. There you can see more clearly that your image sharpness is getting worse if you stop down too much. But I will talk about macro photography a bit later in this video. And then the second thing is the focal length. The longer your focal length is, the less depth of field you get. And then a shorter lens will give you more depth of field. So this means that with telephoto lens you get less depth of field than you get with the wide-angle lens. And here are some examples. The focusing distance is the same, the aperture is the same. The only thing that is different is the focal length of the lens. And you can see there's a clear difference. And then the third thing is focusing distance. The closer you are to your subject, the less depth of field you get. And if you go further away, the depth of field increases. And as you can see on these 2 examples, the aperture is same, the lens is same, the only difference is the focusing distance. And here's a tip: if you don't get enough depth of field to your image, then back up a bit and go further from the object, and then crop your image in post, and you will have more depth of field. Of course, this applies only, for example, to small object. This does not work when you do landscape or something like that. But when you're photographing a small thing or object, or maybe even a portrait, this way works. Well, what about macro photography then? If you stop down to f22, you will have diffraction in your image, and you will lose sharpness in your macro images. So are there any solutions to this? Because even with f22 you will get very, very shallow depth of field in macro photography. And of course there is. You can use focus bracketing, and even some Olympus cameras you can stack those images, and I have a video about focus stacking and focus bracketing in my channel. So if you're interested in macro photography and have been having trouble with depth of field, you might want to watch that video. I will put a link in the description of this video to that video, and of course there will be an end screen to that video also. So be sure to watch that if that's something that concerns you. But remember, also focus stacking can be done manually, but it's a lot harder to do. Well, how do I know how much depth of field I get? You have a few options, but of course if you're really experienced, then your experience will tell you. You just know. But we all are not that experienced, so there are, as I said, a few things. You can chimp, but that's not always the best way, because you might not be able to repeat the shot you took. Most cameras have so-called depth of field preview button, and pressing that will show you the amount of depth of field. You will see the image as it will be recorded to your memory card. In Olympus cameras, like in many other cameras, actually most cameras have the preview button right next to the lens in front of the camera. And in some Olympus cameras, when you're using the Pro lenses, which has the LFN button, that can be customized to be the preview button for depth of field also. So that might be one place to set it. And if your camera has focus peaking, like most Olympus cameras have, that's also a good way of checking how much depth of field you will get. But of course, this is not the most accurate way, but it gives you an estimate, and you can, you know, especially in close-ups, you can have a rough idea how much depth of field you will get. So that's also a handy way. And remember that you can also customize the color of the focus peaking in Olympus cameras. And of course then there are calculators online and also apps for calculating how much depth of field you will get. Then there is one thing that has to be mentioned about depth of field. There's always less depth of field in front of the focusing point than there is behind the focusing point. The rough area is that 2/3 of the depth of field is behind the focusing point and 1/3 is in front. And that is really important thing to understand, because that is a crucial information to know when you are focusing. Like in these 3 cups, if I focus in the first one, I will have some of the depth of field in front of the first object where there is nothing. I don't need to be sharp in front of the object because there's nothing. If I focus to the next object, then I will have some of the depth of field in front of the second object and some of behind the second object. So all these 3 objects will be sharp. By focusing to the second object, I also move the depth of field backwards a bit, so that the depth of field in front is also covering the area where the objects are. I hope I said it clearly. I don't know, it's a bit hard for me to explain this in English, but I hope you understand that. But as you see, this is very important to understand, so that you can kind of get most out of your depth of field. And then there is a thing called hyperfocal distance, and I quote Wikipedia again. Hyperfocal distance is a distance beyond which all objects can be brought into acceptable focus. What it means that at the hyperfocal distance is the focus distance that gives the maximum depth of field. Let's say that you have a 17mm lens on a micro four thirds body. You set the aperture to f5.6 and then you set the focusing distance about 3.5 meters. What it means, you will have everything sharp from 1.7 meters to infinity. You don't need to focus at all. Very good method in street photography. And the hyperfocal distance method is also used or widely used among landscape photographers. And before we go into the reasons why depth of field is so important to understand, let's talk about the sensor size for a while. For this one, I asked my good friend Matti Sulanto, a fellow YouTuber, to help me, because he has a Panasonic S1, which is a full-frame digital camera from Panasonic.
All right, now we're here with Matti. How you doing? Long time no see.
Long time no see. It's I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Thanks. It's cold.
It's cold. Yeah, it's getting winter. Winter is coming, as they say. Now we're here testing the depth of field, and as I said at the beginning of the video, that the sensor size or the film size does not matter. It's all about something else, and we'll test. And Matti had to put his big, bulky Lumix S1 on a tripod because
S1R.
S1R, sorry. He can because he cannot hold it in his hand. It's too heavy for him. So that's why I don't have it on a tripod. But we have this scene where we're gonna test, and I'm gonna show you that it's not the sensor size that matters. But let's start.
So it's 50 millimeters, right?
Yeah, 50 millimeters. We both have 50. You have, what lens do you have there?
I have the 24-105 f4.
Okay, I have 12-100 millimeters. So they are pretty good.
Yes.
And we're using f4. And we have the same scene, and I will take a picture after you with the exact same spot, with the same focal length, and we will see that there won't be any difference in the
I'm now at
focal length.
Okay, I'm now at 50 millimeters f4. Is ISO 100.
Yeah, so go ahead.
And I manually focused on that exact spot we agreed.
Yeah. All right, and let's see. Then I will have the same. Then we'll take the image. I wonder why I had the self-timer on. I don't know, but it doesn't matter.
Just to make sure.
No, yeah, just to make sure. And here you can see the images, no difference in the depth of field because we had the same focal length, and that what matters. Of course, my crop is tighter.
Yes.
Because it's more wide lens on a full frame, the 50 millimeter.
Yes.
And this is more a telephoto lens on this one. So that's the difference. Depth of field is the same.
Yes.
And let's take the next one. And the next one will be so that you have the camera exactly the same spot. And then I will go and take with the same focal length. I will make the same crop. So I have to go way back there so that we can get the same crop.
Would you like me to take another shot?
No, you don't have to. Of course, it's going to be different. Well, I will take the shot from here. All right, now I have the shot. Here you can see the images. In my image, the depth of field is bigger, or there is more depth of field because I was further away. So it was the focusing distance that matters, not the sensor. And let's take one more shot. I will take the same image as Matti has taken with his camera, and now I need to take my camera away from the 50 millimeters and need to make a wider shot. Let's see how it goes.
So you dragged me all the way here just to make one picture.
Yeah, I did.
Oh man.
And here are the last two images. As you can see, my image has more depth of field than Matti's because I had a wider focal length.
Yeah,
so
25.
25 and you had 50. So it's not the sensor, it's the focal length on this one. So that's why the sensor size is not the thing. It's the focal length and the focusing distance. As I've been
and the f-stop.
And the f-stop, of course. But hey, thanks Matti for helping me with this.
My pleasure.
With this bulky camera, and be sure to check out Matti's channel also. He's a YouTuber too. He normally makes more of Micro Four Thirds videos, right?
Micro Four Thirds and Lumix related videos, yeah.
Yeah, because he's a Lumix ambassador, so now I'm gonna kick him out of the video.
And after this part, I will give you an assignment, so be sure to watch the whole video. And then to the question why it is really important to understand depth of field. The simple answer is that it's a very powerful tool in creativity, because with shallow depth of field you can hide things, and with more depth of field you can reveal things. So it's a very, very important thing in composition. And with narrow depth or shallow depth of field you can lift up your subject from the background. It will be the sharp thing, because the human eye works so that we see lighter parts of the image first, and also we see the sharpest areas in the image first. So with the proper sharpness, or proper focusing and proper use of depth of field, you will guide the viewer's eye to the places that you want. So that's why it's really important to understand the concept of depth of field. Nowadays we talk a lot about bokeh and shallow depth of field, and in some conversations I think that it's the most important thing in the world about photography. But no, there isn't a right amount of depth of field in general, or there isn't that if somebody asks how much depth of field do I need, well, it's up to you how much you need. It's your creative decision, and that's why the idea that only shallow depth of field is right is totally wrong. And the funny thing is that actually the word bokeh is quite new in photography. I only heard it when we got into the digital photography. Nobody was talking about bokeh in the film era. I don't know why. It just wasn't a thing. And also shallow depth of field as a creative element is quite new. Back in the days, as I said, in street photography, they used the hyperfocal method so that everything was sharp. And it's actually a lot harder to photograph so that everything is sharp. And of course, it's easier to make composition with shallow depth of field because you can hide things. You don't have to take the background into consideration that much. You don't need to worry about the background because you can just throw it out of focus, no problem. But then you kind of separate the subject from the surroundings, which okay, sometimes might be good, but to get more of a story in your image, you might want to have more depth of field, and then things get harder. And that's something that I think every one of us should practice. And when you have more depth of field, you need to think about the relationship between different objects in your image. You have something in the foreground, something in the background. You need to think about in two ways. How does the object add into your story, and how is it composite, or how you have made the composition of your image so that the viewer's eye go the way that you want it to go in, so that the story goes on in the image. This is very hard, one of those things that's really hard to understand, but when you start looking at images, try to think when you first see an image, what are you looking first, and what are you looking at next? Sometimes you don't realize because your eyes are moving so fast, but try to think images like that. And then the assignment. In November, choose your widest lens. It doesn't matter how wide it is. It can be, well, maybe not a fisheye. If you have a fisheye, don't do that. But let's say 12 millimeter, 14 millimeter, and if you're in full frame, you use 24 millimeter, 35 millimeter, the classical street photography and landscape focal lengths. And set your camera to f8 and your focus to 4 meters, and use that for the whole November, and see what you learn and see how the experience is. I'm going to do that. Are you in? If you are, please let me know in the comments down below. I hope this video made any sense. It's actually a very interesting and easy concept about depth of field, but to be honest, it's quite hard to explain so that you really understand it if you don't. But this, I think it's one of the basic things that if you don't know the concept, then it's really hard to make good images intentionally. Maybe you can, strike a few lucky ones, but to be consistent making good images, you need to know how to control depth of field and how does it affect your images, and how you can vary the depth of field in different images the way you want them to be. And next you might want to watch these tutorial videos about photography. And then there is the other one is about the focus bracketing and focus stacking. But hey, thanks for watching and bye for now.
Mä en nyt yhtään tiedä mikä
Ei se
tässä on
mitään.
kässäri.
Ei se mitään, mäkään.